Let me start with a simple question that sounds dramatic, but deserves a serious answer. Are we drifting toward a war that almost no one says they want, but many seem to be preparing for anyway? Over the past several weeks, the language between Washington and Tehran has sharpened. Not exploded, sharpened. And in geopolitics, that distinction matters. This is not about a single headline or a viral clip. It's about a pattern, signals, legal positioning, strategic moves that don't scream war, but quietly make it easier for war to happen. History tells us that major conflicts rarely begin with one sudden decision. They begin with accumulated choices, with red lines drawn vaguely, with misunderstandings that harden into doctrine, and with leaders on all sides convincing themselves they are reacting, not escalating. So let's slow this down. Let's strip away the noise, and let's talk calmly and clearly about what is actually happening, why it matters, and what comes next if the current trajectory continues. Here are the facts as we know them. The United States and Iran have been locked in a state of sustained hostility for decades. That's not new. What is new is the combination of three things happening at the same time: increased military signaling in the region, legal and rhetorical shifts in Washington about what constitutes a justified use of force, and internal political pressures in Iran that make de-escalation harder, not easier. Each of those elements alone is manageable. Together, they are combustible. The immediate backdrop is regional instability. The Middle East is under extraordinary strain. Conflicts overlap, militias operate across borders, proxy forces blur responsibility. When something happens, attribution becomes contested almost instantly, and that is precisely the environment where miscalculation thrives. The U.S. position publicly is consistent. Officials say they do not seek war with Iran. They emphasize deterrence. They frame military posture as defensive. And to be clear, that is not an unusual position for an American administration to take. Every modern administration has said some version of this. But words are only part of deterrence. The other part is credibility. And credibility, in military terms, often means being prepared to act. That preparation is visible: increased readiness, expanded deployments, enhanced coordination with allies. None of this is secret. None of it is accidental. It is designed to send a message. The Iranian leadership hears that message very clearly, but they hear it through a different lens, a lens shaped by decades of sanctions, covert operations, assassinations, and what they see as broken promises from the West. And here is where interpretation becomes crucial. From Washington's perspective, deterrence prevents conflict. From Tehran's perspective, deterrence can look like preparation for regime-threatening action. Those are not symmetrical interpretations. And when two sides interpret the same signal in opposite ways, the risk is not rhetoric. The risk is reaction. Now let's talk about law, because this is where things often get oversimplified in public discussion. Under U.S. law, the president has broad authority to use military force to defend American personnel and interests. That authority is not unlimited, but it is substantial. Over time, successive administrations have interpreted it expansively, often with congressional acquiescence, sometimes with congressional silence. International law adds another layer. The concept of self-defense is recognized, but what constitutes an imminent threat is notoriously elastic. One administration's imminent threat is another's speculative risk. Why does this matter now? Because when legal justifications are widened in advance, they lower the threshold for action later. This is not about bad faith. It's about institutional momentum. Once a framework is established, decisions become easier to justify under pressure. And pressure is exactly what defines this moment. Iran is under intense internal strain. Economically, politically, socially. The leadership faces a population that is younger, more connected, and increasingly skeptical of the system. In that environment, projecting strength externally can serve a domestic purpose. It signals control, it signals defiance, it rallies hardline support. At the same time, Iran's regional strategy relies heavily on proxies, groups that operate in gray zones, groups that provide plausible deniability. That strategy has been effective precisely because it complicates retaliation. But plausible deniability has limits. When attacks escalate in frequency or impact, attribution becomes less important than response. And that is the danger zone. When the United States decides that responsibility no longer needs to be proven conclusively, but merely inferred. This is not theoretical. We've seen this logic before. Now let me pause here, because this is a moment where many viewers instinctively pick a side. pro-American, pro-deterrence, or deeply skeptical of military escalation. But this analysis is not about moral alignment. It's about understanding systems. Systems do not require malice to produce catastrophe. They require friction. Think about how decisions are actually made in moments of crisis. Intelligence assessments are incomplete. Time is compressed. Leaders rely on advisors who are themselves operating under stress. Everyone believes they are acting responsibly. That is how wars begin without formal declarations. Here's the pivot point in this story, and it's subtle, which is why it's easy to miss. The question is no longer, will the U.S. and Iran go to war? That framing is too blunt. The more accurate question is this: are the safeguards that previously prevented escalation still intact? And the answer is increasingly unclear. Diplomatic channels are thinner. Trust is lower. The nuclear agreement framework that once served as a stabilizing mechanism is effectively dormant. Back channels exist, but they are fragile. And every public threat makes private reassurance harder. At the same time, domestic politics in the United States complicate restraint. No administration wants to appear weak in the face of attacks. No president wants to risk American casualties without response. And no leader wants to be accused of inviting aggression through caution. That creates a ratchet effect. Each response must be slightly stronger than the last, or it is politically vulnerable. Now let's talk about what is not being said publicly. There is a growing recognition among defense planners that a direct U.S.-Iran conflict would not be clean, short, or contained. It would not resemble past wars that Americans might recall. It would be asymmetric, regional, prolonged, economically disruptive. Oil markets would react instantly. Global shipping would be affected. Allies would be drawn in whether they want to be or not. Cyber operations would expand the battlefield far beyond the Middle East. This is precisely why leaders say they don't want war. But saying you don't want something is not the same as structurally preventing it. So what would escalation actually look like? It would likely begin with something that appears limited, a targeted strike. A retaliatory action framed as proportional. Both sides would emphasize restraint even as they act. Then comes the response, not necessarily immediate, not necessarily symmetrical, but deliberate. At each step, leaders would believe they are controlling escalation. History shows that belief is often misplaced. And here's the most important point, the one that should stay with you. The danger right now is not intention. The danger is momentum. Momentum built from unresolved grievances, from legal rationales waiting to be used, from political incentives that punish patience more than risk. This is why the current moment rings alarm bells among analysts who are not prone to alarmism. There is still space for de-escalation. That matters. No one should pretend otherwise. Diplomacy has not vanished. It has narrowed, and narrow pathways require deliberate effort to keep open. But that effort has to be sustained quietly, consistently, and often invisibly, because public posturing, while politically useful, tends to undermine private compromise. As a viewer, as a citizen, the most important thing to understand is this: pay attention not just to what leaders say, but to what they normalize. Watch how thresholds shift. Watch how language evolves. Watch what becomes routine. When extraordinary measures become ordinary, the ground has already moved beneath our feet. So are we on the brink of war? Not inevitably, not yet, but closer than many headlines suggest, and farther than most official statements admit. And the difference between those two realities is where history is usually made. That's why this story matters. Not because it guarantees catastrophe, but because it reveals how fragile stability really is, even when everyone insists they are acting responsibly. And that fragility deserves our full attention.